The low growl from my dogs was the first warning. The second was the sight of my HOA president, standing in my backyard with a pair of bolt cutters and a chunk of my destroyed cedar fence. She'd just crossed a line from bureaucratic bully into a criminal. And she had no idea I was watching from the porch or that I was prepared to end her reign for good. She was admiring the lake view, my lake view, as if she had a right to it. A feeling I knew all too well settled in my gut, the cold calm before a storm. In the Marines, you learn to recognize the exact moment a situation escalates beyond negotiation. This was that moment. She hadn't seen me yet, and in that small window of time, I assessed the situation. The bolt cutters were industrial grade. The cut on the fence was clean, deliberate. This wasn't an impulse, it was a premeditated act of aggression. Let me back up just a second. My name's Trevor Langston. After a decade in the service, I came home looking for quiet. I work remote IT support now, a job that requires logic and patience, two things that were about to be tested in ways I never imagined. I bought this house 2 years ago for one reason, and one reason only, the lake. It's a small, private body of water, the kind of place that feels like a secret the world forgot to tell. The property line extends 20 feet into the water, a fact clearly marked on every single county plat map and my deed. To make sure there was no ambiguity, I reinforced the shoreline with a sturdy cedar fence after some folks from the HOA started poking around, talking about assessing community resources. I knew what that meant. Assessing was HA speak for, we want a piece of what you have. Ellen Everhart, the self-appointed queen of Lakewood Pines, had always eyed my lake access like it was some unclaimed territory on a map she was determined to conquer. At every single monthly HOA meeting, it was the same tired routine. She'd bring it up under new business, her voice dripping with faux community spirit. Trevor, she'd say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Wouldn't it be lovely if the neighborhood could enjoy the lake too? Think of the children. My answer was always the same, delivered in a flat, unchanging tone. No, Ellen. It's on my deed. It's my property. It's mine. I wasn't trying to be a bad neighbor. I was just a man who valued his privacy, something I'd earned the hard way. Apparently, she decided today was the day she would take matters into her own perfectly manicured, law-breaking hands. I stayed on the porch, leaning against the railing, letting the silence stretch. I wanted her to feel the weight of her transgression before I ever said a word. Finally, I called out, my voice cutting through the morning stillness, "You lose something, Ellen?" She jumped like a startled cat, spinning around with that fake, tight smile she wore like a second skin. It was her armor, the one she used to steamroll anyone who questioned her authority. Oh, Trevor, I didn't see you there. I was just inspecting the property line. She gestured vaguely with the bolt cutters, as if they were a standard tool for a morning stroll. I raised an eyebrow, letting my disbelief hang in the air. She actually had the nerve to laugh, a short, brittle sound. Well, the HOA board voted to allow access to the lake for all residents. Your fence was obstructing that access. A necessary removal, you understand. I set my coffee mug down on the porch rail with a deliberate click. Then I whistled once, a single sharp, piercing note that cut through the air. From behind the shed, my two German shepherds, Brutus and Shadow, came trotting out. They moved with the silent, efficient grace of predators. They weren't pets in the fluffy sense of the word. They were my companions, trained and loyal to a fault. Their hackles were up, ears forward, moving in perfect sync like a pair of furry, four-legged missiles. They didn't bark. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was a statement, and it was enough to make Ellen freeze solid, her smile finally faltering. "Trevor, what are you doing?" she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and stripped of its earlier confidence. "You can't sick dogs on HI officials." "They're not sicked on anyone," I replied calmly. "They're just patrolling my private property. You know, the one you just trespassed on and vandalized." Brutus, the larger of the two, walked right up to her. He didn't bare his teeth or make a sound. He simply sniffed her hand, the one holding the bolt cutters, and then let out a low, deep growl that seemed to vibrate in the air. It was a warning, clear and unambiguous. Ellen scrambled backwards so fast she nearly tripped over the very fence post she'd just destroyed. "I'm going to report this," she shrieked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "This is intimidation." "Oh, please do," I said, my voice dangerously soft. I held up my phone. "I've got 3 high-definition cameras recording this entire inspection. I also have a copy of the property deed, the official county survey, and the state laws on criminal trespassing printed out in a neat little folder right inside my door. I'm sure the sheriff's department will be very interested in your interpretation of HOA authority." Her eyes flicked from the dogs to the porch, then back to me. The mask was gone. All I saw was cornered rage. "You've made a big mistake, Trevor." "No, Ellen," I said, already dialing. "You did." I didn't even wait for her to respond. I hit the call button. "Let's see what the sheriff thinks about your inspection." Before the call even connected, she turned and bolted, scrambling through the hole in the fence she'd created. She didn't look back. Brutus watched her go, then sat down with a quiet thud, positioning himself like a soldier standing guard over a perimeter. I looked over at Shadow and muttered, "Well, buddy, looks like the HOA war just went hot." And in my mind, the battle plans were already forming. I had every intention of finishing it. Deputy Rains arrived 20 minutes later, his cruiser's tires crunching on the gravel of my driveway. He was a big man who moved with a deliberate slowness, taking his sweet time getting out of the car and adjusting his belt as if the humid morning air personally offended him. We'd met once before, a brief interaction over a fireworks complaint the previous 4th of July. He seemed to remember me. "Morning, Trevor," he said, his gaze immediately falling on the shredded fence. "Looks like you had a visitor." "Sure did," I replied, motioning toward the fresh, gleaming cuts in the wood. Ellen Everhart came through with a pair of bolt cutters and an inflated sense of entitlement. He crouched down, his knees popping audibly as he inspected the damage. He ran a gloved finger over the cut marks. "You got her on video, you said?" "3 angles. High def. The audio is clean, too. You can hear the snap of the wood." He nodded slowly, pushing himself back to his feet. "You planning to press charges?" As I handed him the folder, I felt a shift. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about drawing a line, not in the dirt, but in principle. "Here's the survey, the deed, the criminal trespassing statutes," I said, my voice steady. I was done playing defense. This was the first counterattack. He took the folder and flipped through it, his eyebrows raising slightly when he got to the sections I had highlighted. "You did your homework." "She's not going to stop unless someone makes it official," I stated. "This has been building for months." He stood up, stretching his back with a groan. "Well, this isn't some simple homeowner dispute anymore. This is straight-up felony vandalism, given the cost of that cedar." He paused, looking from the folder to me. "And if she used her HOA title to justify a crime, that's an abuse of power. And if she got others on the board to go along with it, even secretly, that's conspiracy. It means she wasn't just in trouble with the HOA, she was in trouble with the law." That last part hung in the air. Civil conspiracy. It wasn't just one rogue president anymore, it was potentially a compromised board. If she had colluded with others, pushed a vote through under false pretenses, or used the board's authority as a shield, this was far bigger than I had realized. Before he left, he asked for a copy of the camera system's data file. I handed him a thumb drive I'd already prepared. "You'll probably get a visit from her attorney," he warned, sliding the drive into a sealed evidence bag. "They usually try to bluff and intimidate you into dropping it before it gets to court. Don't engage. Let your lawyer do the talking." "I've got one lined up already," I said. "Retired JAG officer. Owes me a favor." The deputy let out a low whistle. "You don't play around, do you?" "Neither does Ellen," I replied. "She's been sniffing around that lake for months. This was just the first time she got bold enough to act." He tipped his hat. "I'll file the report today. You'll get a call once the DA reviews it." As his cruiser disappeared down the road, I knew her visit was just the opening shot. The real battle was about to begin. And my first move was to document everything. I spent the rest of the morning like a crime scene investigator on my own property. I walked the fence line again, documenting every detail with my phone. I measured the cut section, bagged the slivers of wood that showed the bolt cutter marks, and even found a tiny scrap of torn fabric caught on a nail. It was blue polyester, the exact same shade as the power blazer she always wore to meetings. By noon, I'd replaced the broken section not with more cedar, but with thick gauge chain link and a brand new, no nonsense sign. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I mounted a new camera on the post, this one with license plate recognition, aimed squarely at the alleyway she'd used for her approach. By evening, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing. I heard from Phil, my across-the-street neighbor, while we were both dragging our trash bins to the curb. "Hey, Trevor," he called out, his eyes glancing toward the lake behind my house. "Heard Ellen tried to liberate the shoreline." "Word travels fast," I said with a wry smile. "My wife was walking the dog when she saw her run out of your yard like her hair was on fire," he said, stepping closer. "Looked like she'd seen a ghost." I chuckled. "More like two very large, very unimpressed shepherds." He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial habit of his. "You know, you're not the only one she's tried to push around. Last year, she fined the Harrisons $300 for parking their own boat trailer in their own driveway. Said it violated community optics. Total nonsense. Was that rule in the bylaws?" I asked. "Nope." She made it up on the spot. They tried to appeal, but she blocked it from ever going to the full board. Said she was streamlining enforcement. That phrase stuck with me. Streamlining enforcement. It sounded less like governance and more like a dictatorship. That week, I wasn't just building a case. I was uncovering a pattern. Every door I knocked on, every hesitant conversation over a fence or in a driveway, revealed another family she'd bullied. The folder of grievances grew thicker, and with it, my resolve hardened. This was bigger than my lake access now. It was about an entire community held hostage by one person's ego. The next morning, I filed a temporary injunction with the county clerk's office to legally prevent any unauthorized access or modifications to my property by the HOA or its agents. It wasn't flashy, but it was a legally binding shield. My lawyer, Colonel David Rourke, a man whose courtroom demeanor was as sharp as his uniform's creases, joined me on a video call that evening. "She's not just overstepping, Trevor," he said, his eyes scanning the HOA charter I'd sent him. "She's fundamentally rewriting the rules without due process. This clause right here on unanimous board amendments for property alterations, she's bypassing it entirely. That makes every single policy she's enforced in the last year potentially invalid." I leaned back in my chair, the pieces clicking into place. So, what happens if the board didn't actually authorize her actions at my fence? Then she acted under color of authority, Rourke said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. That's unlawful, and it opens her up to significant personal liability, not just the HOA. An idea began to form. What if I could prove she's been using HOA funds without transparency? Rourke's expression sharpened. That would be a game changer. Embezzlement, fraud, misappropriation of funds. You'd need financial records, proof. "I know someone who might be able to help with that," I said, thinking of Karen Wu, the former HOA treasurer who had stepped down suddenly last quarter. She'd always seemed uncomfortable in meetings, fidgeting whenever Ellen spoke over her and dismissed her financial reports. I found Karen's contact information in an old email thread and left her a voicemail, asking if we could talk, strictly off the record. She called back that night, her voice a nervous whisper. "Trevor, I've been waiting for someone to finally push back," she said, skipping the pleasantries. I couldn't take it anymore. Ellen was using HOA funds for projects that were never approved by the board. Landscaping contracts with companies that didn't exist, security patrols that never showed up. She even tried to get reimbursed for a property development feasibility study that no one on the board ever saw. My pulse quickened. "Do you have proof?" "I copied everything to a private drive before I resigned," she confirmed. "Bank statements, invoices, emails. I knew something like this would happen. Would you be willing to testify if this goes to court?" There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her weighing the risk. "Yes," she finally said, her voice firmer. "But only if I'm subpoenaed. I can't risk retaliation otherwise." She's vindictive. I can make that happen, I promised. The next day, Colonel Rourke filed a formal, legally mandated request for all HOA financial records under the state's nonprofit corporation laws. They were legally required to respond within 15 business days. If they didn't, we had clear grounds for a court order. I didn't have to wait that long. 2 days later, I came home from a supply run to find a plain white envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't from the mailman. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the HA's law firm, a slick downtown firm I knew had a reputation for aggressive tactics. The letter accused me of creating a hostile environment for board members and intimidation through use of aggressive animals. I scanned it, then immediately forwarded it to Rourke. He called within minutes. "They're panicking," he said, a note of amusement in his voice. "This is textbook deflection. They're trying to paint you as the aggressor to muddy the waters before we even get to a hearing. Can we countersue for harassment?" I asked. He chuckled. "Oh, we're way past that, Trevor. We're building a case for civil damages, seeking an injunction to dissolve the current board entirely, and I'm passing Karen's information to the DA's office."
The next week was a quiet storm. I continued gathering statements from other neighbors, people who had been fined improperly, denied appeals arbitrarily, or pressured into using HOA-approved contractors who charged double the market rate. I compiled everything into a master timeline, cross-referencing dates, documents, and names. It was a meticulous, detailed web of abuse of power. Then, 2 nights before our scheduled preliminary hearing, someone tried to break into my detached garage. The motion sensor floodlights snapped on, bathing the driveway in stark white light. The would-be intruder bolted before my cameras could get a clear shot of their face, but they were clumsy in their haste. They left behind a crowbar and, unbelievably, a clipboard with the Lakewood Pines HOA logo emblazoned on it. I handed everything over to the sheriff's office in evidence bags. Deputy Raines came out personally this time.
"They're getting desperate," he said, examining the clipboard with a weary sigh. This was either a profoundly stupid intimidation tactic or someone was looking to destroy evidence they thought you might have. I filed for an emergency protective order the next morning. The judge granted it within hours. Ellen Everhart and any known member of the HOA board were now legally barred from coming within 200 feet of my home. That afternoon, I received an anonymous package in the mail. No return address, just a small, padded envelope. Inside was a single USB drive labeled Board Minutes, Private. I plugged it into a secure, air-gapped laptop and began listening. The recording was from a closed-door HOA executive meeting a month prior. Ellen's voice was crisp and unmistakable. "If we can't get Trevor to comply with the community access plan, then we'll have to make him regret being so difficult. Think code violations. Noise complaints. Let's make his life hell until he falls in line and sells." Another voice, a man's, chimed in hesitantly. "Isn't that harassment?" Her reply was cold and immediate. "It's enforcement. If he wants to play hardball, we'll bury him in paperwork and legal fees until he begs us to take the property off his hands." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Her voice was cold, calculated. This wasn't just a recording, it was a confession. And I knew right then, the entire game had just changed. With the drive securely in my possession, I called Rourke. His response after hearing a portion of the audio was succinct. "This just became a whole different kind of case," he said. And Ellen just handed us her own news. The courtroom was colder than I expected for a late spring morning. Not in temperature, but in the sterile, impersonal atmosphere. It was a place where stories were dissected into facts and emotions were rendered into exhibits. Colonel Rourke sat beside me, his pressed charcoal suit a stark contrast to the worn wooden bench. He was methodically flipping through a thick binder of our exhibits, his focus absolute. He didn't offer words of encouragement. He didn't need to. His preparation was the only reassurance I needed. He leaned in just once before it began. "Judge Mullery, been on the bench 22 years, he murmured. Doesn't tolerate theatrics. Let the evidence speak." And speak it did. Ellen sat across the aisle, 2 rows ahead, flanked by a young lawyer in a tan blazer who looked like he was barely out of law school. She kept her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her jaw clenched tight. She never once looked back at me, probably because she couldn't stand to see the man she'd so thoroughly underestimated sitting there, calm and prepared. The recording from her closed-door meeting played first. The air in the courtroom went stiff. The scratch of the clerk's pen was the only sound. Then came her voice, clear and chillingly distinct through the speakers. Let's make his life hell. The judge didn't just pause it. She stopped it like she'd been stung. She looked over her glasses, first at the speaker, then directly at Ellen. In that heavy, stretching silence, you could feel Ellen's entire defense crumbling. Where was this recording obtained? Judge Mollery asked, her voice even but sharp. Rourke stood. It was sent anonymously to my client, Your Honor. We've submitted a forensic report confirming its authenticity and identifying the time and location via metadata. The HA's own digital calendar, which we subpoenaed, confirms the meeting occurred and the participants' voices have been identified. The judge's gaze remained fixed on Ellen. Is that your voice on the recording, Ms. Everhart? Her young lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, we'd like to reserve judgment on the validity and context of this recording. That wasn't the question I asked, counsel. The judge cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. I asked if it's her voice. Ellen finally turned her head, not to look at me, but toward the judge. A single, quiet word escaped her lips. Yes, the first domino had fallen. Next came Karen Wu's sworn testimony. She entered the courtroom through a side door, clutching her notes like a shield, but her steps were purposeful. When Rourke asked how HOA funds had been handled under Ellen's presidency, she didn't blink. There were recurring payments made to two companies that do not exist in the state business registry, she said, her voice clear and steady. One of them, Pine Horizon Services, received over $15,000 in 6 months for community maintenance. The invoices for the so-called security patrols were fabricated. Ellen used these phantom vendors to hide the movement of funds. The judge tilted her head. And you have documentation to support these claims? Karen passed a binder to the clerk. Every check stub, bank transfer, and vendor record. I made copies of everything before I resigned. Ellen's lawyer jumped up to object, citing privacy and internal HOA policy, but Judge Mollery waved him down dismissively. This is a civil hearing regarding the potential misuse of corporate funds and violations against private property. Transparency is not optional here, counsel. By the time Deputy Raines took the stand, Ellen's posture had collapsed into a defensive hunch. The confident, power-suited president was gone, replaced by a woman shrinking into her chair. Raines outlined the incident report from my property with professional detachment, describing the bolt cutters, the fence damage, and the itemized evidence I had provided. Then he moved to the break-in attempt. We recovered latent fingerprints from the crowbar left at the scene, he said, holding up the lab report. They are a confirmed match to a man named Desmond Hale. Mr. Hale has a record in Nevada for petty theft and vehicle tampering. He is also Ellen Everhart's nephew. A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. Ellen visibly flinched, her face paling. Rourke stood slowly. And was Mr. Hale affiliated with the Lakewood Pines HOA in any official capacity? Raines nodded. According to their internal roster, he was recently listed as a community liaison contractor, though no such position exists in the official HOA charter. The judge turned her full attention to Ellen. Miss Everhart, did you authorize your nephew to enter Mr. Langston's property? Ellen's lawyer frantically whispered something in her ear, but she waved him off. No, she said, her voice barely audible. He misunderstood a conversation we had. I never instructed him to go there. Judge Mallory's expression was one of profound skepticism. You expect this court to believe that a man with a criminal record independently decided to break into a property that is central to an ongoing and contentious legal case involving his own aunt. There was no answer, just a crushing, damning silence. By the time the hearing ended, the temporary protective orders were extended indefinitely. Ellen was placed under formal investigation for misappropriation of HOA funds, and a preliminary recommendation was issued to the state to initiate a full, forensic audit of Lakewood Pines HOA's financial records. Outside, The press had already started to gather, a small pack of reporters sniffing around the courthouse steps. Burke and I didn't stop for interviews. But as we walked toward my truck, a familiar figure stepped out from a sedan parked near the curb. It was Harold Green, one of the longest tenured residents in the neighborhood. He'd always been quiet at meetings, a man who observed from the back row. But now he walked up to us with the look of a man who had something to say. "I've been on the HOA board for 16 years, he said, nodding respectfully to Rourke. Ellen took over as president 3 years ago. Ever since then, it's been meetings behind closed doors, unexplained expenses, and more fines handed out than I've seen in the last decade combined." "You knew something was off," I said, more a statement than a question. "I suspected," he replied, his face etched with regret. "But I could never prove it. She blocked all access to the detailed financial books. Said we were streamlining governance. I didn't know she had gone this far. Are you willing to testify to that if this goes to trial?" Burke asked. Harold looked me dead in the eye. "I'll bring every meeting minute and budget draft I've got saved on my computer. She's disgraced this neighborhood, and it's time it stopped." That evening, I hosted a quiet gathering at my place. It wasn't a party, just a chance for some of the neighbors who had been caught in Ellen's web to talk without the shadow of the HOA hanging over them. People brought folding chairs and set them up in my backyard. Someone brought lemonade, another brought a pie. It felt normal, communal, for the first time in a very long while. Phil from across the street showed up with a folder of his own. "I found these," he said, laying down a stack of letters on my patio table. "Every one of these citations came with a threat of a lien on our homes, but look, none of them are signed by more than one board member." Rourke, who had stayed for the gathering, glanced through them. "That's illegal under your own bylaws," he confirmed. "It takes a majority approval of the board for any enforcement action that includes a financial penalty or lien." A murmur spread through the group. By the end of the night, I had a list of nearly 30 residents ready to sign a petition demanding an emergency vote to dissolve the current board and appoint an interim committee until the official investigation concluded. Not a single person hesitated to add their name. 3 days later, the county prosecutor filed formal charges against Ellen Everhart for criminal mischief, conspiracy to commit trespass, and embezzlement. Her bail was posted, but the damage to her influence was absolute and irreversible. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen pending the forensic audit. County investigators seized records from the management company she had used, whose staff quickly admitted under questioning that several invoices had been backdated at Ellen's personal request. The sheriff's department sent a cruiser to patrol the neighborhood every evening for the next week, not because of any threats, but to prevent any cleanup activity by any of Ellen's remaining loyalists. They never found anything suspicious. Most of her supporters had already melted back into the background, distancing themselves from the sinking ship.
By the following Monday, the interim board was appointed by a judge. Harold Green was unanimously selected to chair it. One of their very first acts was to nullify every single citation and fine issued in the past 12 months. Then, they voted to rescind all bylaws Ellen had passed unilaterally without a proper quorum. I didn't celebrate, not yet. I walked along the edge of the lake that evening, the cool breeze cutting across the water's surface like it always had. Peaceful. Still mine. Shadow trotted beside me, his ears twitching at every rustle in the reeds. Brutus stayed behind, a dark silhouette watching the porch. A good sentinel always does. When I reached the far edge of my yard, I noticed something half buried in the mud near the fence line, an old weathered sign Ellen had tried to install months ago. It read, "Community Access Trail, under HOA development." I pulled it from the dirt with a grunt, snapped the rotted wooden post over my knee, and tossed both pieces into the trash bin on my way back to the house. The lake was never for the HOA. It never would be. And now, finally, the whole neighborhood knew it. 2 months passed. The lake shimmered under the summer sun, untouched and quiet. But the neighborhood itself had changed profoundly. There was a shift, a subtle but unmistakable lightening in the air. An unspoken understanding had settled over Lakewood Pines. The era of Ellen's dominance was over. Mailboxes were no longer filled with intimidating violation notices. No more strangers in reflective vests roamed the sidewalks with clipboards, measuring the height of people's grass. People waved again, not out of obligation, but with genuine warmth. But things weren't settled, not entirely. The county's forensic audit had uncovered something far uglier than anyone had expected. What began as a review of financial mismanagement became a full-blown criminal investigation into a sophisticated scam. Ellen hadn't just rerouted funds for fake landscaping contracts. She had orchestrated a shell company scheme. Karen Wu's meticulously copied records exposed the pattern: recurring, exorbitant payments to a company called Pine Horizon Services, listed as a specialized maintenance vendor. Its listed business address was a UPS drop box in a strip mall 2 towns over. When investigators traced the registered owner, they found the paperwork led back to a closed LLC, with Ellen's maiden name on the articles of incorporation. That was the final nail in her coffin. The district attorney's office indicted her on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, falsification of corporate records, and conspiracy to commit financial abuse of a nonprofit entity. The case was elevated. When they raided her home, they found a burner laptop. On it were spreadsheets tracking resident fines and, more chillingly, projected revenue streams from targeted enforcement zones. The documents even included color-coded maps of the neighborhood, with certain properties, those with elderly owners, those who had lodged complaints, those with valuable land, marked in red. Mine was at the top of the list. A county investigator later told Rourke that Ellen had a long-term plan to force buyout offers on homes near the lakefront through a campaign of attrition, hoping to consolidate control of the properties and resell them as a package deal to a private developer she'd been negotiating with. She'd never gotten far enough to formalize it, but the emails were damning enough. The state attorney general's office took over the case once the full scope became clear. Ellen's trial was fast-tracked due to the overwhelming volume of digital and physical evidence. She was denied bail after surveillance footage showed her attempting to withdraw large sums of cash from multiple bank accounts the day before her arrest. The trial became a local media sensation. A headline in the paper called it the most brazen abuse of HOA power in county history. Reporters packed the courtroom gallery every day. I didn't attend. Rourke represented my interests during my deposition, and I had no desire to watch her squirm under the lights. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what she had tried to tear down, right here at home. The interim board worked quickly and transparently. Harold Green, now acting president, implemented sweeping reforms. All enforcement actions were paused pending a full community review. Financial authority was transferred to a bonded third-party fiduciary. The old management company was fired. Every resident received a mailed summary of the audit's findings, along with a formal apology signed by every member of the new board. It wasn't just damage control. It was a fundamental reset. One morning, I was patching a section of my side yard when a woman I didn't recognize approached from the sidewalk. She looked to be in her mid-50s, carried a canvas tote bag, and wore a wide-brimmed sun hat that shaded her face. "You're Trevor, right?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Yeah," I said, brushing sawdust from my gloves. "Can I help you?" "I'm Vanessa. I moved into the townhome section last year. I wanted to say thank you." "For what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Genuinely." "For not backing down," she said, a slight tremor in her voice. "My mom lives with me. She got fined last winter for leaving a single ceramic planter on our porch. Ellen said it violated conformity standards. We couldn't afford the fine, so they started threatening a lien. My mom was terrified." I nodded once, the story depressingly familiar. "I never thought it would stop," Vanessa continued. "Then you fought back, and everything changed. People started talking to each other again." She lowered her voice. "We weren't even sure we were allowed to before." "You always were," I said quietly. "They just made you think you weren't." She handed me a sealed envelope. The new board is forming a permanent oversight committee. They want you to chair it. I almost laughed. I'm not a politician. That's why they want you, she replied with a small grin. You're the only one who didn't want power, even when you had it.
I tucked the envelope into my back pocket, not giving her an answer right away.
That evening, I stood at the edge of the lake with Brutus and Shadow. The water was as smooth as polished glass. Across the shoreline, where Ellen had once tried to stake her imaginary trail, the wild grass had grown back, thick and lush. A few ducks floated serenely near the reeds. From behind me, Harold's voice cut through the quiet. Figured I'd find you down here. I turned. He was holding a clipboard and a bottle of hard cider. Thought you didn't drink, I said. I don't. This is for you. Figured you earned it. I took the bottle and set it on the railing. What brings you? We've finished reviewing the charter. Every single amendment Ellen passed is being struck. We're setting term limits, mandatory open meetings, and the treasurer position will now require an independent audit every fiscal year. Good, I said. It's overdue. Harold looked out at the lake. You know, she really thought she could take this from you. She didn't understand what it meant to people. It was never just about the lake, I corrected. It was about control. He nodded in agreement. There's talk, serious talk, of dissolving the HOA entirely. I raised an eyebrow. Is that even possible? It's rare, but yeah. State law allows it if a supermajority of homeowners votes to disband. We'd transfer basic maintenance of the common areas to a simple volunteer committee. No more dues, no more board, no more fines, just neighbors. The idea hung there, weighty and tempting. You think they'll go for it, after all this? Trevor, he said. They're ready to burn the whole thing down and start fresh. He handed me the clipboard. It's the petition. Enough signatures and we can officially call the vote. I glanced down at the page. There were dozens of names already, people I barely knew, but who had seen enough. Without a second thought, I took the pen and signed it.
The vote happened 3 weeks later in the community center. The turnout was higher than it had ever been for any meeting. People brought lawn chairs and coolers, and their kids played tag in the grass outside. A neighborhood that had once whispered behind closed doors now laughed openly in the sunshine. When the results were announced, a staggering 92% in favor, cheers erupted. The Lakewood Pines HOA was officially dissolved. The management company was terminated. Control over the common areas reverted to a simple cooperative agreement between residents. The lake, protected under private deed, remained untouched, a quiet symbol of the whole affair. I didn't give a speech. I just stood near the back, my arms folded, watching as people hugged, clapped, and passed around iced tea. Harold raised a toast. Vanessa played music from her phone. Someone started grilling hot dogs. It felt like a block party, maybe the first real one our neighborhood had ever had. Later that night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat on my back porch with Rourke. He'd driven in for the vote, though he mostly stayed quiet, observing. You know, he said, sipping from a glass of water, I've seen a lot of petty tyrants in my day. But Ellen Everhart might just take the cake. She wanted to be a queen, I said, looking out at the dark water. She just forgot it wasn't her kingdom. He laughed once, a short, sharp sound. You planning to stay? I looked at the dark silhouette of the trees against the sky. Yeah, for a while. He stood to leave. Well, if she tries to appeal her conviction, call me. Otherwise, I think this one's finally over. He left the glass on the railing and disappeared down the walkway. I stayed there long after the sun dipped below the trees. Brutus lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws. Shadow paced the edge of the porch, scanning the darkness like he always did. Loyal, watchful. The wind picked up, rustling the trees along the water's edge. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. That was the real victory, not just winning the war, but securing the peace. The lake was still mine, but more importantly, our neighborhood was finally ours again.